This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me.
Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to the Right and Left Discussion Forum. Our purpose is to demonstrate that people can have different political views and still have civilized discussions about potentially contentious topics. We believe that being right is not as important as the relationships we have with each other that enable us to share this country. Today's topic is, should our election laws be shaped to select the best leaders or to make voting as effortless as possible for most people? Our discussion panel today, beginning on my left, is Bryan Laubaugh, President of R&B Financial Services and member of the Medina County Republican Executive Committee. On his left is Patty Haskins, retired math teacher from Wadsworth High School and Democratic member of the Wadsworth City Council. And on her left is Jerry Ritzman, partner of and vice president of Ritzman Natural Health Pharmacies. We lead off today with Bryan Laubaugh. Bryan, our country is involved in an ongoing debate over voting regulations. Some people think that voting should be as close to effortless as possible, regardless of the opportunities for fraud, because the thought being that the more people who vote, the more the country benefits. Others believe that an effort should be made to assure that only qualified voters should vote. What do you think?
Well, John, this has been an ongoing debate for many, many years in our country, and you just have to look to the Constitution and the amendments that have been passed and ratified that basically speak to this issue of somehow abridging an individual's right to vote. I think I'm more in the middle with the right or privilege aspect of voting. I would not agree that we need to make the voting process effortlessly. I think what we have currently in our state works. I would turn to Patty to share some of her experiences. She works the polls. I think that there needs to be some, I guess, investment, if you will, of the individual that wants to vote. I sort of look at this as more of a driver's license situation. You don't have a right to drive. It's a privilege to drive, and you need to exhibit certain capabilities to drive a car. I have no problems whatsoever with photo ID. I think that the more we look at that particular situation, you know, when we start throwing around terms like suppressing the vote, disenfranchising people, I think that's a real false argument. You know, I think if we're going to look at the same thing as far as voter fraud, you know, if there's such a low amount of voter fraud, then I don't think it's that difficult for an individual to fulfill the necessary requirements of voting. I think an educated voter is the best voter. I'm not aware if they still teach civics. I had to take a civics class or a government class. That was a requirement in high school.
You're an old person.
Yeah, I'm an old person.
They still do.
They still do that here in Wadsworth? That's great to hear. I even, in college, I took a couple of government classes just as electives. So I think the individual needs to be educated. I'm not in favor of any sort of real abridgment of an individual's ability to vote, but we need to make sure that the system maintains it's a credible system. It works, and I really don't think we need to sort of mess around with the you know, with the overall process of voting. I think it's easy enough to vote.
Patty, there are a lot of activities going on in the country right now since the Supreme Court ruled that part of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. Yes. And then almost immediately Texas went into action and required voter photo IDs. And they also took 7 days off of the early voting, I believe. And the Justice Department has now filed a lawsuit against Texas, saying that it was racially motivated. Where are you on this entire process?
I think Texas wasn't the only state.
North Carolina did too.
I was going to say Georgia, but am I wrong on that one?
I haven't heard of Georgia.
Okay.
I've heard of North
I do know
Carolina.
Texas went directly into it. Yeah. I was a little disappointed with that decision to begin with when they...
From the Supreme Court?
Yes. Yeah. Only because that law was put into place to make sure that people were able to vote and people were not prevented from voting for extraneous reasons. And simply to say, well, the problem's solved, it doesn't exist anymore, I think was a mistake. It was working, so I felt it should, continue to stay in place. You mentioned like the photo IDs. The problem with photo IDs is we do have a large population that does not have, it's not a majority, but a large population that do not have photo IDs. Plus there's an expense involved with them. Now some states have said, okay, you have to have this ID, but we're going to provide it for you free to make sure that...
I think that all states have because of the 24th Amendment against poll tax. It was a fee for an ID in order to vote.
There's still an ID for a state ID here in Ohio.
It's $8.50, and I'm a little bit confused by that.
I thought it was a little more, only because I just got one for my mother a year and a half ago. And because her driver's license had expired, could no longer drive, had no ID whatsoever. So
If you said it was for the purpose of voting, I'm wondering if they charged the fee.
I still think they would have, and it was really kind of, for example, my mom is, right now she's 87. I had to go to the county health board to get a copy of her birth certificate, because a lot of 87-year-olds do not have a copy of their birth certificate. She was born at home, which was quite common at times, and sometimes the birth certificates weren't filed, at which time I found out that her birth certificate had been filed with her name spelled wrong. So all of these years, her name was wrong. was able to correct that, and then did have to pay the fee to get her registered. She could not have done that by herself. She needed a daughter to do it for her. So I think in the case of the elderly, that is difficult. Plus, there is a fee that is involved with it. So I think there is something to be said about the fact that the photo ID can prevent certain aspects of our population from voting. One of the things, and I agreed with a lot that Bryan said today. I think the educated voter is the most important thing that we have. It is tough to do that, but the educated voter is the best voter. But what I think is additionally important is that we have an electorate that are electing people that are representative of the country. Right now in this Congress nationally, I think it's 83% are male, which, not saying there's anything wrong with that. However, that is definitely not, the makeup of this country. Now, do I want any kind of force? Does it have to be 50% male? No, I want the best candidate in there. But from the beginning, there's been a male dominance. Another figure that was kind of surprising to me was that the net worth of those in Congress was close to $1 million, which is 9 times higher than the average or the median net income of our country. And I think that we need to have people in office that best represent all of the country, not just a fragmented section. One of the ways I think you do that is by making sure that your electorate represents all slices of life here in this particular country.
I wonder what the average net worth would be of the freshman members of the Congress. They haven't had a chance to accumulate.
I think in some cases it's already high because the cost, and we discussed earlier campaign finance reform. In order to run for that office, you have to be a millionaire, or you can't. Another interesting thing I found is that I didn't realize there's still 22 countries that have mandatory voting. Now, only 11 of them enforce this, but you are required to go into the polls, and vote. And I'm not sure that that's what I want here.
Yeah, wouldn't that go over well?
But I mean, like Australia has mandatory voting, and they're
Yeah.
one of the countries that enforces that. But since 1886, the Supreme Court has held that voting is a fundamental political right.
I'm sorry, what?
Since 1886, the Supreme Court has held that voting is a fundamental political right.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
And the thing is, every step the Supreme Court has taken, with maybe the exception of the recent one on the Voting Acts, right, have been to broaden the base for voting, whether it be granting women the right to vote, different races the right to vote, raising the voter, lowering the voter age to 18, which happened, I remember the first election that I was allowed to vote in, and I was already 21 when that happened because I could not vote at 18.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I want to restrict it even more.
Jerry,
Yes.
tell me what your thoughts are.
My thoughts is that I need some education here from you folks. And Patty, you work at the polls, right?
Yes.
If I'm a new voter and I show up wherever it is to register to vote,
Yes.
what do I need to do? What do I need? Do I just come in and say, I live at a certain address and I want to register to vote?
Well, first you have to register to vote or to actually vote?
To register to vote.
To register to vote, I believe, because that's done, you can't do that the same day.
I
Some
understand
states have
that.
same-day registration.
Yeah.
You have to provide proof of your address and residency. Now, that can be done with a driver's license, and it's really the same requirements that you get with actually being able to vote on the same day. A valid ID does not have to be a driver's license. It can be a state ID. It does not have to be a picture one. It can be a utility bill that is sent to your home in your name. It can be your selective service card or military.
All right.
I'm trying to remember if a passport, and I believe a passport is valid as well.
So one of those items.
One of those items, and there's a list of about 7 or 8 of them that you can have. I'm always surprised at how many people go to vote without their driver's license with them. And it's people that have one, they just don't show up with it.
Well, that's voting, not registering.
Right, but the same thing when they show up.
So I could not be a U.S. citizen, but be renting an apartment and have a utility bill sent to my apartment in my name, and I could go register to vote.
I don't believe now, to my knowledge, there's no way they check your citizenship.
Okay.
Unless they require a birth certificate, and they may require a birth certificate to register. I take that back, they do require a birth certificate to register, so.
In addition to those items?
Yeah. Because those establish the residency, but I believe a birth certificate is required, and that would address
Establish
the
citizenship.
Citizenship.
Okay.
Okay, or citizenship papers that
Okay.
would make you a citizen, and that would be to register.
Okay. All right.
Now, if you're voting absentee, how do you produce a photo ID?
You wouldn't.
You don't have to.
Well, unless you mailed it in, because you do have to mail in. Well, I actually have. I vote early at the polls. I mean, at the election board. That's just something that I've done because I end up working in the day of the elections. But for absentee, I know when you get that form. Have you ever voted absentee?
We've sent absentee ballots to our kids at school.
Don't they have to send in?
They have to request an
absentee ballot. You know, Jerry brings up a good point here, and that is the registration process.
Yeah.
You could look at that process and say, that is suppressing the vote. That is disenfranchising people because, they have to produce these particular documents to have the right to vote. I don't have a problem with anything that Jerry said or the process with that. If you're registered to vote and you've qualified yourself to vote, you should be able to vote. The notion that you can show up on a day to vote and not produce any sort of ID, not even knowing that you're in the book. If you go to vote, they look up your name in the book, and you have to sign the book. I've heard of instances where people just show up, they sort of make a scene about it because their name's not in the book, and there's a judge
They're in the wrong precinct.
They might be in the wrong precinct, and they get turned away. I don't think that's suppressing the vote. I don't think that's, in essence, disenfranchising anybody. I don't,
Usually what's done is they fill out a provisional ballot,
they do a provisional ballot.
and then that is taken to later scrutiny.
Then they check all those types of documents out.
Yeah.
I think that the process that we have in place with the amount of days that you can vote early, I voted early in the last presidential election. There were no problems whatsoever. Went in, took maybe 20 minutes. If you're complaining about standing in line for 20 minutes or going to vote, at a particular odd hour, I just don't see any merit in that. I think the process works, and we probably need to tighten up a few areas that that have come up in past elections. So,
Actually, I agree with that. I just don't want to make it more strict with, but I agree.
just to register,
Or just,
that's pretty,
I would think that if we have confidence in the registration system that only U.S. citizens are being registered to vote, that we should do everything that we can, to make it access to voting, even go to internet voting, if the security is correct there. And just because of the changes in lifestyle and responsibilities and that type of thing, absentee ballots, early voting, that type of thing. I think that we should encourage that. If it is secure, and if we're confident, that there are not ways to get around somebody that should not be registered voting.
We currently have 30 states that require a photo ID for election. And recently Texas is requiring it, North Carolina, and I think Pennsylvania, it got through their legislature last year, and I'm not sure what happened. There was a referendum.
I think
Yeah,
there was a
was.
judge that ruled that they had to stay.
But the argument you hear most often is the one that Patty just put forth, is that it's expensive. And it may be prohibitive for somebody that lives below the poverty level. To get a birth certificate. I know that I talked to our associate pastor, and they came from the Carolinas, she and her husband came, and he needed a birth certificate, and by the time he got done with everything, it cost $65. And that they were able to pay that, but the question is, what about people who are below the poverty line? Can they possibly pay that kind of money? And here's the thing that bothers me about that. If you want to if you're below the poverty line and you're registered for food stamps, you've already had to prove your citizenship, and that you need a Social Security card. In order to get a Social Security card, you have to have a birth certificate. So, and in order to be on welfare, you have to have a birth certificate. And I'm thinking, who is too poor to get a birth certificate if they are not poor enough to qualify for food stamps, welfare, and they're not on Social Security? Who's left out there that's not able to get a free photo ID from the state? And I know we talked about it. The fee in Ohio is $8.50. I saw it yesterday. But I don't know whether it was the Supreme Court, whoever ruled that charging for a photo ID for the purpose of voting is in violation of the 24th Amendment, which is the one that prohibits the poll tax or any other tax. So it's necessary. A state has to require to give that free, and essentially all you have to do is to provide the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. You don't have to jump through hoops. Your mother didn't have to go to. You didn't have to go to Medina. You didn't have to get a birth certificate in order to vote. You need a copy in order. Well, this is a requirement for absentee voting. In addition to your name and address, date of birth, and driver's license number, if you've got one. You need a copy of your current and valid photo ID or a military identification. or a utility bill,
Right.
including your cell phone number. I don't know why that got snuck in there.
And if they can afford a cell phone,
Yeah, a bank statement, a government check, a paycheck, or other government document that shows your name and current address.
That's an or, that's not an and.
Those are ors.
Yeah,
Yes.
so it's not, you're not
Yeah.
required to have a cell phone. Okay, so,
but if you do have a cell,
Oh,
the point
okay.
is, if you do have a cell phone,
well, then you
you know,
probably,
you
yeah.
probably can afford
If
$8.50.
you, apparently, if you're using a utility bill as proof of residency, you got to give your cell phone number. That goes along with the cell phone. But you know, my point is that the argument about poor people not being able to afford to get a birth certificate or proof of citizenship, then they are not on food stamps, welfare, and they don't have a social security number, or they would already have a
Well,
birth
they
certificate.
probably have a social security number. People get those at birth now, so.
Yeah.
But I have a problem with having to present a photo ID when I go to vote.
Do you really?
I do. They have a copy of my signature there. It worked for how many years, and maybe it's just because it's change. But, you know, if I go there and say, I am who I am, and I sign that book, and my signature matches, nobody can match my signature, probably.
I've seen your
And
signature.
I know you have, and I don't know. That just kind of put the big brother effect on me that they now need to have a photo ID. I think you can vote without presenting a photo ID, but you have to make some other attestation, or you have to wait around while they check something else out.
In
That
other
if you
states,
say,
you mean?
no, here in Ohio,
But you don't have to vote, you don't have to have a photo.
well, it's inconvenient for you. It takes longer to do it if you don't. There is some.
Well, what about the
way
other
around.
aspects of the things that Bryan referred to, the accusations of voter suppression? Eliminating some of the, Texas is eliminating 7 days from the early voting, from going from 17 to 10. And that, in what way is that voter, I mean, that seems like a lot of opportunities to vote, in addition to 35 days to vote with an absentee ballot.
That's something I probably should be opposed to. I don't really have a problem with that. I think
I'm winning her over.
we're evolving. We discussed evolving. No, the thing is, and you mentioned this, John, it's the idea of having more days to vote is to make it more convenient for people to vote,
Right.
so they don't have to wait in line. There are people that are not going to vote whether, you know, someone shows up at their door and says,
Right.
here's a ballot, please
Right.
fill it out.
Yeah.
There are those that are disinterested in that. You know, and how many years have we had the early voting? We never, when we first started voting, I know for myself, we never had early voting, and I didn't feel that I was disenfranchised. So I'm not sure that day limit is going to cause voter suppression. I mean, they looked at, I think in Ohio in 2012, and I believe it came, you know, John Husted said there were no documented cases of voter suppression here in the state.
Yeah.
That's not to say that there aren't.
Yeah.
But along with that, the voter fraud is very low. There does, you know, when you talk about voter fraud, I mean, then you have to look at, is it at the polls? That's extremely low.
Yeah.
Extremely low. I mean, we're talking 3.
Unless you're a poll worker in Cincinnati.
Well, you know, in Cincinnati, they ended up prosecuting,
She did, and that's good.
well, you're talking the nun.
Well, the other poll worker, the
Yeah.
lady that.
Oh, that's right, there was a poll worker.
Yeah.
They ended up,
Yeah.
I think there were 19 cases in Hamilton County.
Yeah.
Out, and which ended up, I actually have a number on that. 19 cases, and it was 34 10,000ths of a percent of the county's eligible voters. That's really small. Only 3 were prosecuted. And the one was, I believe, the poll worker you're talking about.
The nun.
The other was the nun, and in her case, it was the woman the other nun that she shared space with received a absentee ballot 2 days after she died, and this nun went ahead and filled out the voter thing and signed it and forged it. There's more concern with that, and then of course with registration. But what they found is, like, you know, we're not finding the Keebler elf actually showing up to vote, or Mickey Mouse, or those things are caught. So I think both have been blown out of proportion.
And I wonder if early voting, I think to a certain extent, if it's not too long, may spread out the costs for the boards of elections, where they're, you know, spreading out the workload. But if you make it too long, it may be that
There's a
that
cost.
adds cost to
It
it.
does.
So that may be what Texas is going to
Before
argue.
we run out of time, I want to ask you all this question. Does anybody doubt for 1 minute that this is entirely a political process? Democrats want to make it easier to vote because the easier it is to vote, more Democrats will vote. Republicans want to make it more difficult because there will be fewer Democrats voting. Does anybody doubt that that's what's
I don't
behind?
doubt that at
That's
all.
a general impression.
No,
Yeah.
that would
it's
be a
totally
general
politically
impression.
motivated.
Yeah, that's
Both
just like the
sides.
Republicans like bad weather on election day.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah, when
Because,
it-
you know, these
Lower
wimpy
turnout.
Democrats are not going to show up. They're not going to get wet.
Wimpy, huh?
Well, what about, you know, what about the big question on the table? Does it really matter? Are we really any farther ahead when we have a higher percentage of registered voters actually showing up to vote? Are we better off because of that?
We are, but I think it's got a long ways to go.
Okay, we don't have much time, so I'm going to lay this bomb on the table. Here's an idea. If we want to have more responsible voting, why don't we base it on how much taxes people pay? Everybody gets one vote, but then you get another vote for every $1,000 you pay in income tax.
So the wealthier you are, the more sway you have in the government.
Yes, if you pay $10,000 in taxes, you get 10 votes.
You really expect
Well,
me
they've
to
tried
agree
that
with
before.
Well, how about this?
That's nothing new.
How about
I mean,
these wealthy
yeah.
people that don't pay taxes?
you know,
They wouldn't get, they'd get one vote.
Well,
that
you know,
goes back to owning land and.
I was going to say, the Constitution started, you had
Yeah.
to be a male landowner to,
Yeah.
You know what, I
To
couldn't
vote,
find that
so.
any place, landowner, you had to be a male.
a landowner in the
Yeah.
Sixth Amendment. It's been
yeah.
changed. And then by the Civil War, that Landover thing was just ignored.
Yeah, okay. Well, listen, it's over. Thank you very much. This was another good debate. And I would like to thank all the people that are watching in. And I'm going to have a message for you next time, so please tune in 2 weeks. I'd like to leave you with this quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. All things are subject to interpretation. Whatever interpretation prevails at the moment is a function of power, not truth. Thank you.